Good evening, and welcome to WDI USA's January webinar, Combating the Exploitation of Women and Girls. I'm Kristin Zebrowski, WDI USA's Chief of Staff and a member of the Anti-Pornography Working Group. This webinar, which is being recorded and will be made available soon on the WDI USA YouTube page, aims to educate on the systemic oppression perpetrated by pornography, prostitution, and sex trafficking, to explore links to sex-based stereotypes and the rise of gender ideology, and to mobilize to protect women's sex-based rights and end violence against women. The subject is timely as January is National Human Trafficking Prevention Month. WDI USA works to advance the Declaration of Women's Sex-Based Rights, a global initiative reaffirming that women's rights and girls' rights must be based on their sex. Article 1 establishes that women's rights are grounded in biological reality. Article 8 calls for the elimination of violence against women. Article 9 stresses the need to protect children from harmful gender stereotypes. On the basis of these articles, WDI USA advocates for the eradication of pornography, prostitution, and sex trafficking as interconnected forms of violence against women and girls. Guiding us through the examination of these issues are our speakers tonight, Erin Brewer, Melissa Farley, and Elly Arrow. Our first speaker is Erin Brewer. She is a dedicated advocate for protecting children and women from the harms of gender ideology. Drawing from her own childhood experiences with gender dysphoria, Erin brings a unique and personal perspective to her work. She is the author of Always Erin, Transing Our Children, and Parenting in a Transgender World. She also runs the YouTube channel, Truth is the New Hate Speech, where she raises awareness about this issue. Erin, thank you for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for hosting this. This is going to be kind of a whirlwind presentation, and hopefully I can tie it all together. I just want to start out with acknowledging that mine is a confusing life story. It's hard to explain sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't seem to make sense. It started with a sexual assault when I was a very young girl, which caused my gender confusion. And then I spent my teen years being sexually abused by my parents' best friend, and really was brought up in a home where feminism was to be as much like a man as possible. So that was sort of my conception of what it meant to be a feminist, was to reject your being a female and to become as much like a man as possible. In my young adulthood, I was a separatist lesbian. And then at one point, I was one of Pornhub's top 20 amateur models. Now, I've come full circle to crusade against gender ideology that so profoundly influenced me as a child. I started speaking out publicly when I felt compelled to share my experience of gender confusion because of the harms that the gender ideology is doing, and also to help explain how it is that someone with my confusing life story can sort of help inform the discussion about the harms of gender ideology. And I wanted to start with talking about the damage of early sexualization, because I think that that's one of the overarching issues here, is that children and women are being sexualized just so profoundly at this point. As a child, when you deal with sexual trauma, one of the most common responses is dissociation. And what dissociation does is it makes it harder for you to stay present. And I think that that's one of the reasons that I've had a very confusing life story, is that it's been hard for me to sort of stay grounded in who I am. Another one of the damages of early sexual trauma is trauma bonding. And what that is it's almost a familiarity that you have with trauma. It almost feels safer, because when the trauma is happening, when you're in a sort of in a situation that feels uncomfortable, that almost feels more reasonable than when life is normal. And so that's a very common response, is that trauma bonding, and to feel connected with the people who have traumatized you. In my case, it was men. And in so many cases, when it's sexual assault and abuse, it's men. And then there's something called a repetition compulsion that often develops, which is a desire to sort of try to redo it, but do it right. But because of dissociation and trauma bonding and poor social skills, that repetition compulsion often ends up being very damaging. So the cult of porn preys on vulnerable girls and women in the same way that gender ideology does. I thought it was very liberating when I went on Pornhub. And I thought it was almost like a social justice site, if you can believe it. It gave women of all shapes and sizes, ages and races a platform to be celebrated. And so I really bought into this idea that it was liberating to be on Pornhub and felt celebrated by all these people who were encouraging and embracing and celebrating what I was doing. Unfortunately, if I don't know how many of you have been on sites like Pornhub, but they tend to promote self-harming behaviors and childlike behaviors. And one of the, I was actually just doing solo performances, I guess you'd call it, solo exploitation on Pornhub. People would ask me to perform out their sexual fantasies, and I would do that. And they started getting more and more self-harming and more childlike. And the reason I got into porn is that my therapist at the time was encouraging me to explore my sexuality. And he really encouraged me to kind of dedicate myself to porn. He sort of couched it as me being a social worker, helping men who are watching the porn get their fantasies fulfilled. And when I expressed my concern about the self-harming nature of it, the violent nature of it, the childlike, encouraging childlike behaviors, my therapist told me that I was actually helping sexual predators from acting out in real life. And I believed him. And I think this is one of the things that is very common with my experience with porn and what children today are experiencing with therapists when it comes to gender ideology, is that therapists are affirming very harmful ideas. It is not in any way liberating or something that should be celebrated to be on porn, and neither is it to reject who you are and become somebody else, which is what gender ideology is encouraging. So in 2019, I deleted all of those videos, but they are still widely available on various sites. I actually Googled it yesterday before sort of planning out what to say for my presentation today. And it really was somewhat nauseating, I would say, humiliating. I felt just a great deal of shame seeing how many of the videos are still out there and they're being replayed on various pornography sites, and there's really nothing I can do about it. And I think that that's one of the things that a lot of people who are involved in pornography, they don't recognize, is they think, well, I can post this and then I can delete it at any point. And the porn sites really encourage you to believe that. They suggest that they will monitor and police the porn so that you have complete control over it. And that's just a lie. So some of the other links between the gender confusion, sexual exploitation, and pornography that I want to make is that gender ideology really is a sexual assault. They are targeting sex characteristics of children and young adults, oftentimes cutting them off. And I think that when you couch sexual exploitation, rape, uh, any kind of sexual abuse as a crime of power and a crime against, it's not about healthy sexuality, then it's really clear that, a girl having her breasts cut off is a sexual assault. That a girl taking testosterone to change herself and her, secondary sex characteristics from female to male, so that she looks like a male, that's a sexual assault. That's a basic assault on her as her sex. The other thing that I see this is when I was going through therapy as a child, when I went to school and said that I was a boy, none of my teachers encouraged that. Instead, I was sent to the school psychologist to be worked with. And I'm very thankful for that. But I know that if I were a child today, that my trajectory would be very different. Instead of helping to encourage me to accept myself, I would be encouraged to become a different person, basically, to be told that who I am isn't okay, and that I can kind of leave all my problems behind and become somebody else. And what this does is it hurts the person, but it also hurts the pursuit of the criminal. Because, you know, if a child is sexually assaulted or sexualized in some way, and they are encouraged to transition as a way of uh, dealing with the difficult feelings they're having, that sexual assault, that sexualization never gets dealt with. And so it really is a way of covering for predators, in my opinion. Um, it also encourages that dissociative process, which is so damaging. When you have a child who grows up who's encouraged to dissociate, then they don't learn good coping skills, and they're much more vulnerable to other kinds of exploitation. And we see this when I talk to others who've struggled with gender confusion. There's this dovetailing of gender confusion and sexual exploitation, whether it's pornography or sex prostitution, that these tend to come together. And it's because of this confusion over our bodies. And I also see the trauma bonding element being very similar between um, the sexual exploitation and the gender industry. These kids are really encouraged to bond with those that are encouraging them to embrace a transgender identity and to reject the people in their lives who would otherwise be helping them to come to terms with their difficult feelings. And uh, the other kind of way in which these dovetail is that the porn is so degrading and so humiliating at this point. I mean, it probably always was, but because of the ubiquity of sites, it is, and this is something that I had no clue about. I really had no experience with porn prior to making it, and I had no idea that there was such degrading and humiliating porn out there. And if a girl or a young woman views these kind of acts being perpetrated on women and thinks that that's normal sexuality, thinks that that's in any way appropriate or acceptable, it isn't surprising that she would want to opt out of womanhood. In the same way, there's something called sissy hypnoporn that encourages boys who are watching it to view women as objects and then to view themselves as the women who are objects. And so it encourages boys to basically develop autogynephilia, which is when they're sexually aroused at the idea of themselves as a woman. But it's the idea of themselves as an object, not really as a woman. And that's where it's really important to separate that out. These are not boys who are viewing themselves as women. They're viewing themselves as objects because that's what they've been taught women are. The gender industry also encourages sort of the medicalization of the most vulnerable. The kids who go through medical transition are medicalized for the rest of their lives, and they also lose very important parts of their bodily functions, the ability to nurse children, the ability to bear children, the ability to have normal sexual responses. And this is true for both boys and girls. And to me, it's just horrifying thinking about children who will grow up and never have the opportunity to have a healthy sexuality. And so one of the things that I was asked to do was to put together some action items. And so I'm just going to talk about some of the things that I think are most important. And if anybody follows me on Twitter, you will know that for me, consent is one of the biggest things that I sort of just keep hammering away at. If a girl or a woman can't say no to being sexualized and know that her consent is going to be respected, she really can't fully say yes. And so girls like me who are sexually assaulted, girls who are sexualized when they're little, girls who are told that they have to allow a man into their bathroom, they have lost the ability to consent. And to me, that is a fundamental injury that takes place. And there's really no way that somebody who has that kind of injury can say yes in a fully consenting way, because they don't have that differentiation of what consent is versus what consent isn't. And so I really I feel like, you know, the undermining of consent that happens both in men being allowed in women's spaces and sports, and girls not being allowed to say, no, that's not a girl, that boy has penis, therefore he's a boy. In school, they're being brainwashed they're coerced is a better word. They're being coerced to accept the gender ideology. And so they really don't experience, they have no concept of what true consent is because it's been undermined by this ideology. Um, and I think that the incredible push to allow children to consent is, again, part of the sexualization of children, because if children can consent to transgender interventions, then they can also probably consent to sex. And I think that that's part of what this push is trying to normalize the idea that children are consenting individuals, and therefore, if they want to have sexual relations with an adult, that they can consent. And we know that's not true. We know that's coercive. We know children are not capable of consent. But over and over and over again, I'm seeing gender doctors who are part of the gender activist doctors who are suggesting that children, in fact, should be able to consent to medical interventions that will permanently damage them. So consent is one of the things that I really encourage people to just to keep bringing up, that we don't consent. And even if another woman is okay having a man in her bathroom, that doesn't take away my right to consent. And I have the right not to have a man in my private spaces. And so I think that that's something that um, hopefully would resonate with everybody, regardless of their political background, regardless of their religious background, regardless of, their belief systems. I think most people understand the concept of consent and how important it is. And so and it's also a talking point that those on the left, that I don't even know how to talk about it anymore because it's so convoluted, but liberals, left, Democrats, that's always been something that they have called for. And it's so ironic that this gender ideology comes right on the heels of the Me Too movement, where we were just getting to the point where women were saying, no, we do have the right to consent. We have the right to, all the way along, that our boundaries are important and need to be respected. And so I see the gender ideology as a systematic assault on girls' and women's consent. I also think it's really important to call out grooming for what it is. And I know that grooming is one of those things that got people kicked off of Twitter and Facebook for a while. But what grooming does is it desensitizes children. It undermines their natural inhibitions. It defines our sexuality as something to be objectified. It emotionally separates the victim from their loved ones. It causes them to gain, to share secrets, to keep secrets from people, and it promotes the sexual abuse of children. And so sex offenders test for vulnerability, and they're able to identify vulnerable children and adults based on emotional neediness, isolation, low self-confidence, and kids who don't have a lot of parental attention. So trying to find ways to emphasize to these children that, and this sounds kind of horrible, but I want to say that if somebody's trying to make them feel special, that it's because that person has an ulterior motive. And I hate to make children sort of so paranoid about being around people. But one of the things that I learned is that the man who abused me from the time I was 13 till I was 18, he really promoted it as I was something special, that I was so special that he couldn't help himself, that I was so special that it was love, that love had no bounds, that love had no age limits. And I really believed that, and it took years. It probably took decades for me to finally realize he was a predator. And if it hadn't been me, it would be somebody else, and it probably was somebody else in addition to me. But predators are so good at making their victims feel special. And even on Pornhub, that was one of the things that was so seductive for me. Was I don't have good social skills. I'm on the autism spectrum. I've always struggled with relationships. I've always struggled with, sort of I never thought I was very attractive, and I never had many friends, and I get on Pornhub and suddenly I'm popular. I've got all these people telling me how great I am, saying that it would make them so happy if I could just do this one thing. And I fell for it because I thought I was special. Well, it turns out I'm not special. I'm not special to them. They're just trying to exploit me. And I think very often people who are exploited often they go down that trajectory because initially they feel special. They get love bombed. They do all the things that cults do to help people, to pull people in. And so try to explain to children that there is that component of grooming, that if somebody is really insinuating themselves into your life and that you feel like this is different, this relationship is different, I have to keep it secret because it's so special, then that's a red flag. That's something, and that's one of the things that the people who are grooming kids in the gender industry are doing, is encouraging this idea that these kids are special. There's something very unique about them that needs to be protected. And that, again, is a way in which predators seduce their victims. And it's incredibly manipulative. Um, so, so really, if you can find ways to let people understand that perpetrators intentionally manipulate their victims to feel special, that victims rationalize the abuse often because they felt special. And I'm seeing this again and again with YouTube videos where girls go in and they have double mastectomies and the results aren't good and they know it. And yet they still have this, like, it wasn't the surgeon's fault. He did his best, and it's okay because he'll fix it. I'll go in for revision surgery. Very protective of these doctors who are abusing children. Um, we also need really good quality, trustworthy mental health services. As I said, I had a therapist who encouraged me to believe I was acting as a social worker when I was performing porn, and I believed it. And he would have me come into his office and recount the various videos I had made for that week. And I didn't realize at the time that that was inappropriate. And part of that was probably because I am on the spectrum. I didn't really understand that dynamic was inappropriate. But part of it was also because I had been groomed as a child to not have good boundaries. And so even at my ripe old age, I still struggle with understanding what are appropriate boundaries and when somebody's violating them and how to respond when somebody violates them. And that's, again, the gender industry is just systematically eroding our boundaries and telling us, I can't tell, I mean, I don't know how many of you are on social media, but almost, whenever I post something and there's a trans activist that responds, they initially will tell me I'm ugly or old or stupid or a cunt or tell them to suck their lady dick. Those are sort of the narratives. But ultimately it's this: you're hysterical, you're being silly, you're hysterical. That really minimalization of women's feelings that I thought we got away from when women were institutionalized for hysteria. But that's the narrative that's being used, is that we're being hysterical, we're just being silly. That these, even Tim McBride recently said, like, all of this is a distraction, that us not wanting men in our bathrooms is a distraction, really dismissing our concerns. And again, that's something that historically has been done to women's needs and the issues that we're facing. I also want to encourage people to call out language over and over and over again. Men cannot be women. Don't call them trans women. They're not women in any shape or form. They're men. When it comes to child and adolescent sex workers, no, they're not sex workers. There's no such thing as transactional sex with children. Cross-generational sex are all normalized terms for child rape, and they need to be called out. So if there's a story on the news and they talk about a child being a sex worker or transactional sex or cross-generational sex, that's child rape. And we need to keep emphasizing that, because it's really easy to normalize the idea that children somehow can participate in sexual relationships with adults. And finally, I just encourage you to support the Women's Declaration International and legislative efforts to fight for age verification on porn. And that's a really small step, but it's a really important step, because if somebody has to stop and go through the whole process of getting age verified, it's going to cause them to pause and think about what they're doing. The way it is now in many states, someone can just go and click on a porn site and get in and be watching extremely degrading porn, extremely violent porn, extremely explicit porn, so easily. We don't allow children to buy cigarettes. In some states, they can't even go to a tanning salon. So we shouldn't allow them into spaces that are clearly dangerous spaces. And again, I just want to thank everybody here tonight. Thank you for listening to my story, and thank you for the WDI for hosting this.
Thank you, Erin, for shedding light on the intersections between gender ideology and the exploitation of women and children. Next, we'll hear from Melissa Farley. Melissa is a feminist psychologist and a leading expert on prostitution, pornography, and trafficking. She's authored 55 peer-reviewed articles on trauma, healthcare, and exploitation, as well as 2 books, Prostitution, Trafficking, and Traumatic Stress, and Prostitution and Trafficking in Nevada, Making the Connections. Melissa is also the founder of Prostitution Research and Education, a nonprofit research institute with over 25 years of work dedicated to abolishing prostitution. Its website offers a wealth of educational materials from survivors and other experts on topics relating to ending sexual exploitation. Melissa, we're grateful to have you with us. Please take it away.
Thanks, Kristin, and thanks for inviting me. Thanks for everybody for being here, and thank you, Erin, for that talk. I really appreciate it. If you want to access our website and you're having any trouble, my email is going to be dropped into the chat, and you can get that, mfarley@prostitutionresearch.com. Please get in touch with me. I really love it and respond. And if you want to get on our newsletter, that would be great too. One of the things that's on our homepage right now is what I'm going to talk about today, which is a research report we produced over 3 years with 12 interviewers and 2 statisticians and 7 writers. We produced a report that was titled Pornography Production Harm in Sweden. Filmed prostitution is inseparable from non-filmed prostitution. And that's what I've come to realize over many, many years. When I first started out in the feminist activist movement, the anti-pornography arm of it, we considered pornography completely separate from prostitution. I didn't get it back in the day. And so this report, where we interviewed 105 survivors of pornography production, was written by Erica Bergquist, Merle Aspegard, Joanna Petrus, Michaela Lannergren, Luba Fine, and Nassima Jarari. And by the way, Erin, we have a section in that report where Merle Aspegard, a Swedish survivor herself, who was one of the authors, she was pimped out by her social worker. I think it is the case that there are predators in therapy, social work, and in all of the helping professions because of the very vulnerabilities you talked about. So we recruited people in Sweden by advertising on Instagram and other online forums. And over 3 years, we interviewed 105 women in Sweden using standardized psych tests and open-ended questions. And we did the interviews in person, and they each lasted 2 to 3 hours. So hopefully what I'm going to talk about today will be an action agenda, because even among abolitionists, among feminists, among some gender critical feminists, this information is somewhat new. And our research organization, we produce data that hopefully can be used as information and ammunition in this struggle that we're all engaged in for women to have our own human rights in the world. So how do survivors describe this inseparable link between prostitution and pornography? Evelina Giobbi said many years ago, pornography is filmed prostitution. Somebody else said, pornography is prostitution that's legalized as long as somebody gets to make pictures of it. And a woman in Sweden, in our Swedish research, said, the same person who sold me, he was also there to film me. So he was both a pimp and a porn producer. He was kind of a jack of all trades. Or, as my favorite retired FBI agent, Roger Young, put it, what happened to common sense? The fact that there's a camera filming the prostitution doesn't change the fact of the prostitution. Pornography is essentially, Roger said, a crime scene surveillance tape. You can't say to someone, hey, let's go rob a bank, but if we film it, then it won't be robbery. So for women whose prostitution has been filmed, there's just not a clear differentiation between online and offline prostitution. Pornography is used to advertise prostitution. Pornography facilitates trafficking. And prostitution and porn are not only sex-based abuse, but they're also abuse based on a woman's ethnicity, her poverty, migration, and her lack of options. The greater her economic vulnerability and her social vulnerability, the less power she has to say no to a pornography sex buyer's rapey demand. Pornography is so fully integrated into the sex trade that we can't separate it. Women in the sex trade, including women who are producing porn at home, and the amateur porn that is all over Pornhub, OnlyFans, everywhere online, that is, women will do cell phone production of porn, then they will be moved to wherever the sex buyers are located by their pimp. They go, women don't stay in one type of prostitution. They move back and forth to webcam or cell phone photo pornography production. And then a John will say, oh, you're so fantastic, you're so wonderful, or like Erin was saying, you're so special, I've never seen anybody or met anyone like you. Can't we just have one date? And that happens all the time. We know that 84% of the time, adult women in prostitution or porn are under pimp control. This is the legal equivalent of being trafficked. Consent is not possible under those conditions. One of the most effective ways, I think, that pimps and their political allies run this normalized abuse on all of us is that they compartmentalize different arms of the sex trade. This confuses people, and it mainstreams some parts, namely pornography, of the sex trade. Why do they do this? Because porn pimps benefit when they can artificially segregate an arm of the sex trade and declare it to be in need of legal protections, and it certainly increases profits if some part of the sex trade, whether it's a strip club or pornography, is, quote, legitimate and legally protected. Freedom of speech attorneys promote the idea that a film of prostitution is speech rather than a record of abuse, and they insist that porn is separate from the same acts of prostitution that are not filmed. This free speech argument is a cruel, very cruel, but very profitable lie. So pornography is camouflaged as content creation or speech instead of a filmed record of prostitution, humiliation, and often torture. Porn pimps are not named pimps or traffickers, although that's what they do. They're named managers, protectors, boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, partners. The porn pimp propaganda says that pornography is somehow more sanitized or civilized than prostitution. This is not true. 25% of the women we interviewed in Sweden named pimping gangs who were involved in their porn production. These are the international organized crime groups that are anywhere in the world where they can get a foothold into the sex trade, especially if it's legalized or decriminalized. But also even in places as, quote, progressive as Sweden with a Nordic model law. These gangs are the Hells Angels, also in Nevada, Australia, the Netherlands, the Bandidos, the original gangsters, and Romanian and Nigerian mafias, all operating to produce pornography in Sweden. A whole lot of the 105 pornography survivors we interviewed said that pornography caused more, not less, emotional distress than non-filmed prostitution. One woman said, "I find porn more offensive and humiliating than prostitution. It feels more revealing, more shameful." Another woman said, "It's more invasive than prostitution." And someone else said, "It's more emotionally stressful." And an interviewee in Sweden explained, "Pornography can haunt you for years. Films can be made public and they can destroy everything, relationships and jobs." And of course, according to survivors, the public humiliation is among the worst consequences of pornography. And by the way, state-sponsored torture survivors say the same thing. The humiliation and the public humiliation is the worst feeling of all. In Sweden, our interviewees' boundaries were routinely overridden regarding what sex act was or was not agreed to, how long the prostitution would last, and whether or not they agreed to have the prostitution filmed. Most of our interviewees had experienced both non-filmed and filmed prostitution. And they told us that 64% of the time, their prostitution was filmed without their consent. One woman said, "You never know when you're selling sex if you're being filmed." I interviewed a woman who described she thought she was getting paid for an act of prostitution in a hotel, and the guy kept fumbling around. He was on top of her. He kept fumbling around with his back pocket or something, and finally she realized he was getting his cell phone out and filming her at the same time as he was getting purchasing a sex act from her that was rape for her. So, and another woman explained, when it comes to porn, a lot of people think there will be a studio. It could just as well be a filmed abuse, she said. The viewer will never know. The viewer will never know if there's consent. And even if there was consent, so-called consent, the consequences are still there. What kinds of emotional distress are caused by pornography production? PTSD. You know, we know that 6% of the general population is likely to have PTSD in their lifetime, a very small percent. But among these interviewees who had been in the production of porn, 81% met criteria for a diagnosis of PTSD. This is an extremely high rate of PTSD. And as Erin was mentioning, dissociation is one of the symptoms of PTSD. It's a response to overwhelming stress, and it helps in the moment, it helps people cope with uncontrollable and unbearable traumatic events. Dissociation is a survival technique that numbs you, makes it so you don't feel anything, makes it so you're just not there or you're shut down. It occurs, and dissociation is very common during the extreme stress suffered by prisoners of war who are being tortured, children who are being raped, and women being battered, raped, or prostituted. It's how you survive without giving up, curling up into a little ball and dying, just shutting down and going away. It enables people to survive, but it is not helpful when it carries over to the rest of your life. It really interferes with relationships, with self-protection. It's not the best, dissociation is not the best method of self-protection for anyone, especially adult women. Many women said it was necessary for them to dissociate in order to survive the experience of pornography production. If they did not dissociate, they told us, they felt overwhelmed with disgust, shame, anxiety, and fear. One woman explained what it was like. It's like I'm completely gone while doing the porn. And then I come back half an hour later. I don't even remember what I filmed. It's like a different world. So our interviewees had very high scores on measures of dissociation, and they dissociated much more than women who are not in the sex trade or involved in pornography production. I think I have a couple more minutes. Let me just mention that men's use of pornography is connected with buying sex and other sexually aggressive behavior. We've found in other research in 6 different countries that sex buyers who more often use porn also tended to buy sex more often. It just shows that connection that the women described in Sweden. But the sex buyers who most often use porn tended to be those who committed more sexually coercive behavior, including rape, in the rest of their life, as well as in rape against the women they paid for sex acts. Let me just quickly say, what do apps, websites, payment processors, and banks have to do with porn? Everything. In order to sell sex acts today, whether women are filmed or not, it's necessary to advertise on social media. For our interviewees in this research on porn production, there wasn't any differentiation between their online advertising for porn, advertising for prostitution, and for all transactions, they used payment processors like Swish, PayPal, MasterCard, Visa, and they often used bank-to-bank transfers. This is a little action note at the end of my talk here. The bank-to-bank transfers has a sex buyer or the pornography sex buyer bank on one end and the woman's bank on the other. The 4 largest banks in Sweden were involved in these porn transactions where sex acts were filmed and sold. Banks have a really important role to play in laundering porn pimps' money, or alternatively, in shutting down porn pimps' business operations. Banks are in a position to expose scams and suspicious schemes like money laundering. So, but unfortunately, right now, banks just act as if they're simply conduits for everyday financial transaction rather than crucial players that are facilitating sexual assault and trafficking of women. On the good news side, in 2023, I don't know if, as some of you may know this, but I'd just like to be sure we all have this information. The world's largest bank, JP Morgan Chase, settled a lawsuit brought by victims of the porn pimp Jeffrey Epstein. Would you like to know how much they paid 2 victims? $290 million. Banks don't do that unless somebody has the goods on them. And the victims had a lot of evidence of harm from the photographs of their prostitution that were used and sold by Epstein. Similarly, Deutsche Bank, where Epstein also laundered criminally obtained cash from trafficking victims, Deutsche Bank settled another lawsuit brought by Epstein victims for 75 million. So it's 75 million US. So that's a little bit of good news. Please talk about the involvement of your community bank in trafficking and harm of women. It's one way of going after them. So I'm going to quit now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa, for highlighting the mental health impacts of prostitution and pornography, and also the financial ties. Now we'll hear from Elly Arrow, a Germany-based activist and expert on commercial sexual exploitation. She's also co-host of the podcast Red Light Expose. She focuses on the abolition of the sex industry, sexual trauma, and issues affecting migrant women. Due to the time difference, Elly has submitted a pre-recorded presentation to share her insights on commercial sexual exploitation.
Hi and welcome. My name is Elly Arrow. Today I'm going to be talking about common myths on commercial sexual exploitation. And I can't be there with you live because when you're listening to this, it's going to be somewhere between 2 and 4 a.m. where I am, because I'm raised and based in Germany. And I've been active on this topic of sexual exploitation since 2018. And I started out as a blogger and YouTuber, which I still do, a little more sporadically because other projects take up more time. I am a podcaster on the podcast Red Light Expose, where I'm a co-host with multiple other women from across the world, most of whom are survivors of exploitation themselves. So they've seen the inside of the prostitution and the porn industry, the paid BDSM industry, stripping industry. I'm not a survivor myself, but I'm someone, like I said, who grew up in Germany, where infamously prostitution is legalized and we have an exploded market. And, well, like many, I've come to the conclusion that these laws, even though they say they protect women, don't really result in that. So myth 1 I'm going to be talking about today is the idea that prostitution is the oldest profession, and there's a lot contained in that statement. So it is both that prostitution is inevitable, that is somehow in human DNA, it's our nature, our women's nature, men's nature, and that it is just a way to make money. And it kind of places the responsibility for the existence of the industry, I think, very strongly with the woman herself. There are some women who get the idea, this is how I might make money, because some women are that way. That is why human society does that. Well, since the earliest writings and debating of feminists, women have questioned that narrative. So what feminist historians have done over the years is actually trace the history of prostitution. So it isn't that at some point in like ancient Greece, a woman woke up and goes, you know what, I could commercialize access to my body. Prostitution grows from like a documented cultural shift that at this stage archaeologists and historians can confirm took place. We don't know a lot about, our very ancient ancestors, but we know that there was a time before patriarchy, societies that were not to be idealized. I think most of us would want to time travel and have a life expectancy of 22 years. But we do know that we have ancestors who lived comparatively egalitarian to many of the high cultures that came later. We celebrate these cultures that are sedentary, highly hierarchical, class societies, highly militarized. And because history is often so male-centered, we forget that these were slave societies and that women, by and large, or the majority of women, their position was property. And only when women are culturally seen as potential property, and when we are systematically deprived of resources, and everything's very focused on inheritance through the male line, only when women are demeaned into brute mares and into sex objects can prostitution arise, and does it arise. So it is historically a form of female slavery. And that echoes all the way to today. Prostitution is not today something fundamentally different than it used to be. It is still the most deprived in society that make up the majority of those in the industry. There's many things where we don't have very clear statistics. There are wild estimates on how many people are in this industry today, in the millions, and I can't give you a totally reliable number. Even countries with legalized prostitution struggle because such a huge gray area remains of untracked, unlicensed prostitution that we just don't know. But what we do know is that every study that looks at the makeup of people in prostitution finds they're overwhelmingly female, over 90% female, overwhelmingly impoverished, and indigenous women, ethnic minorities, sometimes oppressed ethnic majorities make up the bulk of those in the industry. And this is why many feminists have said, instead of speaking of the oldest profession, more accurate, we should be speaking of the oldest oppression. And the actual oldest women-specific profession is midwifery. And there are things to be said about being careful of not idealizing the mother role either. But just the fact that, women as life givers, that does not have to be reductionist per se. I think on this issue about the gender debate, we're always battling the idea that just by saying woman is the sex that can gestate babies does not mean woman is the sex that must, right? I don't have to tell that to this audience. But sticking with the modern situation, so the second myth that is very important to bust is the idea that what I might call pimp-less prostitution, so a woman in prostitution for her own profit, and trafficking. So when you have a third party enacting psychological or physical coercion on a woman or taking a huge cut of her earnings, that those two things are very separate. That is absolutely not true. We find rates of overt organized coercion of women in prostitution and in porn, even in high-class escorting, and even websites like OnlyFans. It goes from the street to the highest class escort to women who got famous through the porn industry, and later we find out their husbands, their boyfriends, their cousins, or organized crime had their fingers in the pie and controlled women. So whether it's going to a brothel or opening a porn website, any user of this industry can never truly be sure that what he's watching is not the result of overt abuse. The reality, which was very succinctly summed up with the case of the German megabrothel chain Paradise, where both the convicted human trafficking owner and the judge said it is not possible to stave a sex industry of a large size without overt violent coercion. You need the help of the Hells Angels, the United Tribunes, whatever the organized crime groups in your country are called. They trade in drugs, they trade in weapons, but what can you trade best? Because you can trade it over and over and over again. Women, girls, and some young men. It's also important to know that one individual woman, she might enter prostitution, not with a pimp, just to make a bit of extra money. But pimps will circle around her like vultures and try to entice her. So she might later end up being trafficked. So the sex industry and sex trafficking are not even separate necessarily in an individual's biography. And there is no country that has yet been able to craft any type of law to identify who is there by choice and who isn't. I'll get to that some more in the next myth. But another thing that I'd say is essentially a ruse of the patriarchy is trying to divide women into victims and handmaidens. So the idea is that we need compassion with trafficked women, but not really with those other women that don't have a pimp. When you listen to the stories of women in the industry, this is really not an industry that you can just get up and leave anytime you want. Poverty is a very powerful pimp. Trauma. So when Andrea Dworkin says incest is boot camp for prostitution, it is absolutely true. Many of us, right, we talk about the dysphoric girls. We know many dysphoric girls have been abused. The sex industry too, porn and prostitution, they prey on women who have learned in their childhood and young adulthood that their only worth is their bodies, and that their boundaries don't matter, and that sex is inherently degrading and painful, so actually being paid for it as an upgrade is an improvement. And there are many studies who confirm this connection. This is not a stereotype. And it's understandable that to numb out that experience of such dehumanized existence, many women turn to drugs, alcohol, or hard drugs. And I would argue that those women are anything but handmaidens. So you don't need a pimp to need resources, to need support. That is something that we shouldn't fall into, where we blame the women who are not trafficked for the existence of the industry. And even among the high-class women, I've written about this on my blog, there are many women with a traumatic history. Just because the woman is earning $1,000 a night does not mean she's fine, and does not make her immune to violence, because what also unites these two groups, the women pushed by life circumstances and the women pushed by overt violent third parties, don't meet a fundamentally different set of men. Like I said, the men who go on a prostitution website or a porn website, they can't distinguish who is there for what reason. And they also don't treat women fundamentally better when they assume they're not trafficked. This leads us into the next one, the idea that illegal sex trade is a safe sex trade. Just connecting to what I said, buyers in a legal industry, they feel quite emboldened by the law saying you are just a customer of a service. And when they don't get their way sexually, when the woman promised them an orgasm, but they can't orgasm, or the woman was advertised as doing XY sex act and she refuses, or she wants them to stop because it's degrading or painful, men can get quite angry, and that can result anything from insult, giving her a bad review, to physical assault, robbery, rape, and even murder. I studied 4 decades of publicly available evidence in homicide cases of women in prostitution, and this was a common motive. Even when the industry is legal, like in Germany, the most likely robber, rapist, and murderer of a woman is her so-called client. For people who doubt that, I highly recommend reading material from groups that prefer the term sex work on the kind of workplace safety advice they give women, because it is advice on how not to die tonight on the job. And connecting back to the earlier myth, when prostitution buying is decriminalized, most of the time these countries do not hold men accountable legally for also buying access to a trafficked person. The demand is not seen as an active part, even though anyone who looks into this a little longer will realize that there's a sadistic subset of buyers who actively participate in what human traffickers call breaking in. That is the serial rape of a woman until she will no longer fight back, at which stage she is ready to be offered up to the non-sadist buyers. How does illegal sex trade embolden prostitution profiteers? Every brothel owner, escort agency owner, any man or group of people who orbit around a woman, so-called organizing or managing her sex industry activities, they are treated as ethical managers until proven otherwise. It now requires a judge to sign off on a police investigating any kind of establishment. It usually takes years. Detectives focused on red light industry crime tell us that it is incredibly hard to go after traffickers, specifically because of legal regimes. Even official government evaluations have found this. We found this for Germany. They found it for the Netherlands. New Zealand, which is a darling of the pro-prostitution industry, if they actually sat down and read the government evaluation, as I have, because I wrote a policy comparison of Germany and New Zealand, police explicitly say that they find it harder now to go after perpetrators in cases of child sex trafficking. It's harder to rescue minors. Everyone is consumed to be consenting an adult until you can gain access to the premises, again, with a warrant, and get a hold of enough evidence to say otherwise. When sex trafficking cases make it to court, the very rare times that they do, it is on the victims to give statements against their abusers. Without those, it's almost impossible to convict. Well, traffickers, they intimidate women into silence, they manipulate them into silence, they threaten them with homicide. And that's why many of these cases end up being dismissed, despite ample evidence. Under illegal sex trade, there's this idea that, sex work is work. We've all heard that slogan. that labor rights protections for women will appear. Most recently, there's been a lot of misinformation about Belgium and the new Belgian law that all these women, they will now have social security, health insurance, maternity pay. Well, first of all, why are there pregnant women in the industry? That's a whole dark subchapter of this. Women being prostituted until they're very, very close to delivery. And in Germany and Austria, we've had cases of women giving birth in brothels. What's the misinformation I'm talking about? Most women in the industry, even if there's theoretically the option of becoming a full employee at the brothel, are concerned about control and oversight from brothel owners. Most of them are very transient. They move from city A to city B through to city C. They don't want any kind of paper trail and record of them having been involved in prostitution. The brothel owners would prefer to just rent out rooms, say, I'm not involved with anything else that goes on, not have responsibility towards the women. So both sides have reasons why full employment contracts are almost universally in practice rejected, even when the law makes them possible. So most women are independent contractors. They don't have sick days. They don't have paid holidays. It's a terrible business model to keep paying women if there's no more buyers. Like, again, no brothel can actually function this way in the long term. Another side note, prices decrease drastically and competition increases when prostitution is legalized. So all these workers' protections exist only in theory. And then when we think about OSHA, right, occupational health and safety, how could you possibly apply that to an industry that violates it by its nature? Condom use is not enough. The fact that prostitution at times and porn takes place inside the human body. It deals with bodily fluids. By its nature, the industry cannot comply. I mean, even mandatory condom use is barely enforceable in the industry. In the porn industry, while most porn consumers find the presence of condoms just downright unattractive, so the norm is to not use them. And STI testing is too sporadic. It's not literally between every single shoot. And so STIs, including incurable ones, painful ones, deadly ones, that remains a real risk on top of unwanted pregnancy, intimate injury, PTSD from not being able to say no to or stop especially awful sex acts. In the porn industry, it is the norm that you are paid once the shoot is done. That means if you don't deliver, you don't get the full sum or anything at all. If you haven't filmed the consent video where you say, yes, I loved it, yes, it was fine, yes, I was treated fairly, you don't get paid. Prostitution tends to be the opposite. You usually get paid upfront. That is not necessarily a much better system. Many men, when they're not happy with a service, will assault her and ask for their money back. The idea is, I have invested, you must deliver. Entire subcultures are created where these men talk to each other. Where can I get the cheapest? Where can I get the woman who will do exactly what I want? Where can I do it without a condom? Where can I commit sadistic abuse and get away with it? And they do get away with it en masse. Most of the women, when they are assaulted or hurt, do not take it to the court. It's hard enough to do that as a woman outside the sex industry. The social stigma on the women still remains. They are not regarded as equal citizens. All of this brings us to the next myth, the idea that, okay, you and me, maybe we're not in the industry right now, so therefore it doesn't touch our lives, it doesn't impact us. Well, we live with the men who consume porn, and a frightening number of whom also use prostitution. In Germany, the estimate is that around a quarter of men have made use of the sex industry at some stage of their lives. A smaller number will be these high-frequency buyers who do it on the regular. A number of men in places like Germany, they develop a culture of this going to the brothel on your stag night, there's going to the brothel on your 18th birthday, going to the brothel on graduation day. There's some brothels that have business rooms for business meetings, which kind of by their nature exclude the female employees because most legal brothels actually bar non-prostituted women from entry. Do we think that those men who do these things will then fully respect their wives, their daughters, their colleagues, their female boss, etc.? How can especially marginalized women, so right in Germany that would be women from Eastern European descent, in any poor New York borough, it's going to be the black girls and women who just get approached with how much. We have the example of Leeds in the UK, which had a prostitution tolerance zone in one of the poorest parts of the entire UK. And men were curb crawling, right? Driving down their cars down the street, harassing schoolgirls. It's happened to me many times when I go and look for a place to live. I look for an apartment in any major city. Landlords saying, yeah, you can live here, but the rent is suspiciously low and they are suspiciously flirty. Many of us know what that means and where that will lead. women working in the service industry, if sex is a service, how are we going to get rid of the idea that it's okay to test out, maybe if I tip that waitress, that stewardess, that female salesperson, might she go home with me? Might she come to the hotel room with me later? How will we ever get rid of this kind of abuse while there is a massive exploded prostitution and porn industry? We can't. Because this industry upholds key rape myths, right? The idea that men need sex or they will, like pressure cookers, explode and go rape, when actually the evidence is that avid prostitution users are more, not less dangerous to others and more prone to harassment and assault. And how will we get rid of the idea that women accrue a debt to men when they do us favors, which we could potentially pay through access to our bodies? How can we destroy these ideas? How can we actually do Me Too, or any of these kinds of movements, if we don't look at what's happening to our prostituted sisters and how all of that mentality, it trickles down, it comes back to us in our lives. And despite what we are told, we can fight back. It's not easy. It's about as hard as tackling the issue of domestic violence, which overlaps, and the issue of child abuse, which overlaps, and the issue of poverty, which overlaps, and the issue of addiction, which overlaps. We don't say those things are inevitable. We say it's worth reducing that to make it as small and rare and frowned upon as possible, right? And as much support for victims as possible. There are 7 countries around the world and 2 jurisdictions. So that is Sweden, Norway, Iceland, Canada, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Israel, France, and Maine that have a legal approach to the industry. This is prostitution focused. We still have to adapt it for the porn industry. That is called the Nordic or the equality model. It has not been around long, right? It's only been 25 years, so evidence is still trickling in. It is far from perfect, but here are the core tenets and some of the successes that we have seen. So the first one is full decriminalization of people who sell sex or sexual access and actually investing in support to get out. And also to prevent, right? And this is where we need cooperation between countries like Sweden and Romania, like Germany and Romania, like the US and the Caribbean or Latin American countries to actually make a livable economy, a decrease in the rate of violence against women and girls and where many of the victims come from. This is kind of like we need a big coalition, like the anti-racism, the anti-poverty, etc. should be working with the anti-exploitation people. We all need to be working on all of these things together and to say, we're not willing to sacrifice a subgroup of us to this industry. Make no mistake, this is a gigantuan task. You have the left who wants to keep saying sex work is work and not invest in women and just say that prostitution is supposed an exit rem from poverty, when really, while it is possible to build a life after prostitution, very much so, there are many who deal with long-term physical and mental disability to the point of not being able to work. And then you got the right, on the other hand, who doesn't really want to invest in vulnerable women, in poor women, and in migrant women. But again, same issue with all other kinds of violence against women. We do that fight anyway, and we don't give up just because it's very hard. The next important part of this model is the criminalization of all buyers and profiteers of the industry. So you are not assumed to be an ethical buyer or an ethical pimp. You are assumed to be a criminal. That makes it easier to prosecute. That discourages the demand. That's not to say that trafficking investigations aren't still tricky and prolonged, but the specialized police forces are not as handicapped as they are under a legalized regime. A lot of this is about the social shame. So there are cases of formerly prominent people in Swedish society who are outed as buyers of women in prostitution, who are then publicly disgraced, much as you would expect in a context of Me Too. And that is almost more powerful than the threat of a fine or a stay in prison. The idea that your wife would leave you, right? Because most sex buyers are married. That you might lose your job if it's in the social sector and your boss disapproves. That your mates in the pub don't want to hang out with you anymore because you're an exploiter of women. That's the cultural shift that is needed. Now, there's much, much more to this, much more details and nuance and complexities. Like I said, we talk about it on our podcast, Red Light Expose, but here are some other organizations that you can check out for more information. Nordic Model Now is a website that talks all about the law, about this legal approach and cultural approach and why it's necessary and how it works. Space International is an organization founded by the Irish prostitution survivor and author Rachel Moran. It's an international group of women advocating on this issue. And then there's the Coalition Against Trafficking Women, who do global education and lobbying around this issue. Those are some places you could go for further education on this, and I'm also happy for anyone who wants to follow me. I write and speak about this in short form and long form. You can find most of my information on my link tree, and I'm at Elly Arrow, so that's ELLY Arrow, like bow and arrow. And you can find me on Twitter, on YouTube, on TikTok. Oh, right, that's no longer there for the Americans, but everyone else, and on Instagram. So thank you very much for having me. Like I said, I'm not there with you live, but I can be reached through those social media sites and through the contact form on my website. So please reach out if you have questions or you want to connect about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Elly for sharing her insights with us and for her dedication to abolishing the sex industry. Next, we'll transition to Q&A. Now's your opportunity to ask Erin and Melissa questions. Please use the Zoom Q&A feature to submit questions as opposed to the chat. While we're waiting, I have a question for either of you, whichever would like to answer. But how can activists, researchers, and policymakers collaborate more effectively to combat exploitation, in your opinion?
That's a biggie. Do you want to answer it, Erin, or shall I say something?
Maybe I can talk a little bit about why it's hard to collaborate sometimes. These are issues that bring together people with diverse political leanings and agendas. And so oftentimes it can be really hard to find groups that agree on all of the different agenda items. And I think that's one of the things that I've run into with my work fighting gender ideology, is that you have, radical gay and lesbian groups, you have moms, you have very conservative Christian organizations, and it's very difficult to come together. And I think that that's true with prostitution and pornography as well, that these are issues that can bring together. I was really actually quite shocked to see Gloria Steinem in the picture of Elly's presentation, because she's one who supports transgender ideology. So she's fighting porn but supports gender industry. So I think that that's one of the reasons why it is so hard to bring organizations together. In some ways, I don't know if this is just a rationalization because it is so hard, but I started to think that maybe it's good to have lots of smaller organizations sort of working on issues rather than trying to collaborate. One thing I really would like to see, and I tried this on Facebook about 4 years ago, maybe, a group called 1000 Sisters Strong. And the idea was that people would get on there, and anytime there was, something that needed correcting, like a news organization that talked about, a woman raping a woman when we know it was a man raping a woman, that everybody would go and jump on that organization and the outlet, the whatever, sort of have a big response. And it worked really, really well until somebody wanted to post about an off-topic issue, and then it all fell apart really quickly. So if I were to suggest collaboration in the future, I would say have really clear rules about what topics will be covered and what topics will not be brought off. And the responses, if somebody brings up a topic that's not one of the issues that you're addressing, that it immediately gets removed so that it doesn't cause the contention.
Well, a quick response to that, if that's okay, Kristin.
Yes, please.
Get off of social media
Mhm.
and get in the streets. That's my thought. And in terms of collaboration, we're not going to get politicians to do this, but come together with other people, even if you disagree with them on some issues. For example, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, I have an extreme disagreement with them about gender identity. They think men can turn into women. However, I'll sign their petitions. I will get out there with them if they're demonstrating against Pornhub or something like that. And I think we need specific targeted events and get together with community people who meet with local politicians. Local is what I'm learning from legendary activists in the Bay Area, is keep a lot of it local. That's where we can really move forward on many of these issues, and then it expands. That's it.
Thank you. Ellen asks, what can the average person do to combat sexual exploitation apart from donating money?
Testify. Go to the hearings, legislative hearings, and testify. Very few people show up to those. You don't have to have a personal experience with it. You just go, if just having somebody there speaking on an issue has a huge impact. Write your legislators. And I really encourage to just speak out on why it is these are such dangerous issues, why it is they're so important. And the big one is that women really are unable to have full citizenship, to participate fully in our society as long as these things exist.
Along those lines, a local sheriff in the county I live in was arrested in a sweep in Las Vegas for going to a brothel that was all trafficked Chinese women from southern China, the same place that women and men were trafficked from during the California gold rush. So he dismissed it. Oh, he didn't know it was a brothel. He didn't know it were trafficked women. And a bunch of us raised hell at some local meetings. We showed up. We said that we thought he should be fired immediately, no pension. And I'm not here to tell you it was massively successful, but it was coalition building for me. I found out the people in my actual neighborhood who cared about this issue, and we've stayed in touch. So I second what Erin said about show up at hearings at the local level. A woman cop in Las Vegas once told me, when I was like overwhelmed with the complexity of the sex trade in that state, she said, listen, if you want to learn about how prostitution works, go to a local city council zoning meeting. That's where it happens. And that was very educational advice, because zoning and moving buildings out of sight so women can't be seen by the downtown tourists, but it's very accessible. The zoning decisions are often pushed by organized crime or pimps or their political allies, and we can get in the middle of that mix.
Thank you both. On behalf of WDI USA and the Anti-Pornography Working Group, thank you both for sharing your expertise, and also to Elly Arrow. And thank you to the attendees for taking time to engage in this webinar and discussion. If you're moved by what you've heard tonight, we invite you to get involved. Sign the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights to join over 39,000 people worldwide united in the fight to protect and advance women's sex-based rights. Also, you can support our mission by becoming a volunteer or donor. While we are a women-only organization, we warmly welcome donations from anyone who shares our commitment to advancing women's sex-based rights. Also, follow WDI USA on social media to stay updated on our work and upcoming initiatives. And also keep an eye out for future events and to help amplify our message by sharing your takeaways with your community. Together, we can challenge these systems and work toward a future for safety, dignity, and equality for women and girls. Thank you for your time tonight. Have a wonderful evening, and we hope to see you at our next event.
Thank you very much to everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here.